and Executive Director at Arms Control Association, and joins us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Kimball, it's a pleasure having you on the show. Firstly, these nuclear tests are being described as the biggest mistake made during the French atmospheric nuclear testing program. Can you talk a bit about what went wrong during the tests and the contamination people were exposed to as a consequence?
Well, this new study that evaluated some previously classified French documents on 3 nuclear tests, one in 1966, one in 1971, another in 1974, show that the French government severely underestimated and misrepresented the amount of radiation that the people in the surrounding islands in French Polynesia were exposed to as a result of these atmospheric nuclear test explosions. And so to put this in perspective, we've got to remember that France conducted about 210 nuclear test explosions before it finally stopped in 1985. There were I think it was around 63 in the South Pacific. I'm sorry, 41 in the South Pacific that were atmospheric nuclear test explosions. So this study reveals just a portion of the damage that was created by the atmospheric tests, which continued underground in fragile atolls in the South Pacific until 1985. So I think the French government needs to reevaluate its compensation plan for people who've been affected by the radiation from these tests. I think they owe it to the people of French Polynesia to widen the monitoring and the compensation for victims of their nuclear tests during the Cold War.
What's been the French government's response to the findings? And do you think they will be likely to compensate more people after what's happened?
Well, I'm not aware of a formal response by the French government to this particular independent study, which just came out this past week. Up until this point, France, I would say, has been generally very reluctant to acknowledge the damage from the radiation of the atmospheric nuclear test explosions. They've been very stingy with respect to compensation of people affected. The number of people that have been compensated very low. And so this is typical of the French government with respect to nuclear testing in the South Pacific. But I think this study warrants a change in the French attitude. And I would just note that in 2017, the international community came together to approve a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons as a whole, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Part of that treaty requires that member states provide compensation to victims of nuclear explosions, including nuclear testing. So even though France, a nuclear weapons possessor, is not likely going to join this treaty anytime soon, I think it should actively participate in the discussions regarding this treaty to help states who've been affected by nuclear test explosions that have conducted not just by France, but by 9 other countries through the course of the decades. Nuclear testing today has stopped, but there were 2,000 nuclear test explosions for about 50 to 60 years after the first nuclear test explosion that took place in the United States in New Mexico before the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings.
Mr. Kimball, just to get a better sense of the gravity of what's happened, can you talk a bit about the damage on inhabitants and the environment from these tests?
Well, it's very difficult to assess to draw a direct line between a particular nuclear test explosion and particular adverse health outcomes. But it's well known that even low levels of exposure to radiation can significantly increase the incidence of certain kinds of cancers, for instance, thyroid cancers. And there is a relatively higher level of cancer in some of the French Polynesian islands, on Tahiti, for instance, than you would expect in a normal population, in a healthy population. So there is a clear correlation between, I think, the exposures that are now being reconstructed and reassessed and some of these adverse health outcomes. And so it may not sound severe, but if you know anyone or have suffered from soft cancers like thyroid cancer, it is a very severe illness. It can cause death, but it is something that one does not want to experience. The environmental contamination from the French nuclear testing has severely affected a number of atolls. These are coral atolls in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that have literally been injected with high levels of radioactive material. The coral atolls are relatively fragile. They will likely be affected long-term, the surrounding environment, and there's the possibility of a slow leakage of some of the radioactive contamination that the nuclear test explosions cause. So there has been significant damage from the French nuclear testing in this region, and I think France needs to reevaluate its plan and its approach to helping to address the cause that its nuclear tests have harmed in the past.
And we'll be watching to see if they do that. Daryl G. Kimball at Arms Control Association, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.